But people on the left and even some on the right have gone hysterical over tariffs. But they never understood that President Trump is the deal maker in chief. He knows when to thrust and when to parry. He also knows that America must come first. And that is the riff. All right, let's kick around. Joining me, Katie Pavlich, Fox News contributor, Steve Vaughn, former general counsel to the U.S. Trade Representative, and John Carney, financial journalist. John Carney, I start with you. When will the critics acknowledge Trump is single-handedly reforming the whole world trading system, and it needed it, and nobody else could do it, and he's doing it?
I'll give you the exact date when they'll acknowledge it, Larry. It will be January 20th, 2029, when Donald Trump is no longer in office. They will finally admit that Donald Trump was right. Look, Donald Trump has been following a script the entire time. We called it on Liberation Day on your show, Larry. We pointed out that the Liberation Day tariffs were there for negotiation, that he was going to bring everybody to the table one by one, as you were saying, bilateral negotiations, none of this creation of a new international body. I'm going to talk directly to the leaders of those countries. I'm going to make a deal. The EU president said she didn't have, the U.S. didn't have to give any concessions because trade was already unbalanced. Now they're balancing it. This is what he said was going to happen. The critics didn't believe it. It's happening right in front of our eyes.
Yeah, and Katie Pavlich, I just want to say, one of the hottest areas in the stock market today was energy, liquid natural gas, LNG, which is part of this deal. Now, let's see, it's $750 billion worth of U.S. energy will be purchased by the Europeans, which is phenomenal. Now, that's an economic thing, very cool, but it's also a defense thing, a security thing.
Exactly. It's a defense national security issue. I was in Eastern Europe a couple of weeks ago for the Dubrovnik Forum, and LNG was something that Croatia was talking about, the Eastern European countries were talking about, trying to get off of Russian energy and onto something else. This EU deal certainly does that. It's good for the American economy, but it's also good for our national interests and defense. And there's also weapons purchases of U.S. military weapons in this deal as well. So it gets Europe to make up for what they've been doing over the past couple of years by funding Putin's war machine, by failing their own economies, by going too green and cutting off their own energy sources, buying gas from Russia. Now they're going to be buying LNG from America, and that's great. One last thing on this. It's interesting to look at the types of products that he's keeping the tariffs on. 50% steel, copper, aluminum, because those are national security interests. He's not willing to negotiate on those. He's getting us back to this place where we're able to keep those in, that kind of power in the U.S. hands in order to make sure we're still an international player on that.
That's an important point. It's a very important point in these supply chains. But you know what? When in the first term, when I was involved in all this stuff, every single bilateral we ever had, every bilateral with a European country, I would beg them to buy liquid natural gas.
Yeah.
First of all, it's cheaper. Second of all, it's cleaner. By the way, they have relabeled that now as a clean burning fuel. And third of all, it doesn't depend on Russia. This was before Russia invaded. So now I guess here they're doing it. Better late than never, but it's a big thing. John, you're out there. Where's my Steve Vaughn? Tell me how they can do the $600 billion in direct investment. How does that work? If you're the lawyer for the trade rep's office, is this a sovereign wealth fund, or what is this? Because this is not. Japan is also ponying up close to $600 billion. Europe is ponying up close to $600 billion. How's this done, Steve Vaughn?
Yeah, I think that some of that is still yet to be negotiated. We're hearing different things from both sides. Obviously, there's going to be a lot of private sector investment that plays a role in that. It sounds like what they may be heading toward is a model whereby the government will set targets and work with the private sector in order to accommodate that investment. But I think we'll get more clarity on that over the next few weeks.
Is there a congressional interest in this? I'm reading some interesting commentary about people who are sympathetic to Mr. Trump, but worry that he's kind of stepping on Congressional's fiscal tax and spend prerogative.
I think what you're going to see from the Congress is the Republicans on the Hill have really done a good job of giving the president space to go out and do these negotiations and see what he can get. And remember, he's not making concessions, so he doesn't need to go back and ask Congress to change any of our rules. The concessions are all coming from the other side. So I think he's going to be able to keep most of the Hill on board with the type of deals that he announced yesterday.
John Carney, I want to come back to some economics, difficult as it may be. Everybody, I think, been barking up the wrong tree. Not everybody, but, you know, these tariffs are not inflationary. If anything, they are deflationary. They're taxes, okay? Taxes are deflationary. Too much taxation, you're going to throw the economy into recession. Here's my point, which has been overlooked, and I'm trying to ventilate this today. These direct investments, these are massive cash infusions, okay? I don't know how many of them will pan out. Sometimes Mr. Trump is prone to some exaggeration. But if it's $4 trillion or $5 trillion or $6 trillion in total, you know, trade and non-trade, that massively overwhelms, it seems to me, any deflationary or recessionary threat from a very modest tariff toll of, let's say, 15%, whatever it's going to land, 15, 20%. I mean, I think people have overlooked that. On the one hand, yeah, you're going to pay this little toll to play in the U.S. economy, which is the biggest and greatest in the world. But at the same time, you're putting all this money up. You're putting all this money up, which is going to have a, you know, burst of economic growth. What do you think about this paradigm?
That's right. All of this new injected money will offset the tariff revenue, which is, as you said, a tax. So it will offset that. The other thing is, this is a lot of new revenue for the federal government. It means we can cut taxes even more. We should be looking around, the Republican Party should be looking around and saying, okay, what other taxes are in place that are holding down growth? Let's use the revenue to offset that, or use it to reduce the deficit, which should then encourage the Fed to cut more. They're so paranoid about inflation that they should say, okay, we're reducing the deficit. That should be an offset. They can cut interest rates more. It should be, in the end, not inflationary, not deflationary. It actually should end up just about neutral. But with all of these cash injections that we're getting, I think it actually will end up growing the economy in a non-inflationary way, because we are going to grow supply and not just demand.
It is growth. Katie Pavlich, Democrats don't know what to do. They're besides themselves. They don't know how to deal with this because it's all going well, just among other things. Last week, the Wall Street Journal poll, 47% of voters favor the Trump economy, up 11 points since April. The stock market up nearly 30% since the worst part in April. These deals are very good on the surface when you dig into them. It's stuff that nobody expected. The worst case from the experts didn't happen. What are Democrats going to do about this?
Bitcoin also up. If you're into that, the president has signed legislation to deal with that issue as well. Democrats have no idea what to do. Instead of figuring out, okay, how can we work with the White House, work with this president on economic policies that work for the American people, for example, voting against the big, beautiful bill, they're now nominating people like Zoran Mondani to run one of the biggest economies in the world. So Democrats don't have any policy positions to run on. They're simply running against. And I think it goes back to how dishonest they've been about the Trump administration's economic policy in the president's second term, especially when it comes to BBB and the CBO score, for example, because it didn't take any of these other measures, economic growth, into account when it came to the full picture of deregulation, trade policy, tariff policy, and then, of course, passing that piece of legislation, which Congress is going now to talk about when they go home for the August
recess. We could balance the budget in 5-6 years. With this, I mean, I don't know what
they're just doing things. I mean, they can just go do some things, just like the president is doing.
Yeah, boy, I don't know what they're going to do. I mean, I've never seen a situation. We're going to talk about it later.
19% approval is not great.
It's not all that good, is it?
But it is bottom, so maybe they'll come back up soon.
The worst in the history of the Wall Street Journal poll. We're going to talk about that later in the show. Steve Vaughn, what happens in China? Would you tell me what they're going to do? Another 90-day extension, which I'm okay with. What are you thinking about China?
I think they're definitely going to do at least a 90-day extension. I think a lot of it's going to turn on what sort of movement they see from the Chinese. Remember, they are coming into this with a lot of momentum. They've got to deal with Japan. They've got to deal with Europe. They're getting more support on Capitol Hill. The U.S. economy is doing well. I think the Chinese negotiators, to the extent they were expecting that the president would not have as much leverage. They may have underestimated how well he's doing. So it'll be very interesting to see how this round of meetings goes. And I think the pressure on China to recognize the growing strength of the U.S. is going to be a big part of what happens over the next few days.
Steve Vaughn, another one related to this, because you were so involved with all of us in the first term, the so-called Phase 1 deal with China. What about intellectual property theft? What about forced transfers of technology? What about buying commodities from the farm and from industry and factories and chemicals? You know, all that stuff that we labored over for about 2 years. Lighthizer in the lead. None of it was ever implemented. Okay, they just looked the other way. What happens to that? Do you throw that out the window, or do you go back to that stuff?
I don't think they're going to throw any of that out the window. I think, obviously Ambassador Greer was there, and that he was the chief of staff for Ambassador Lighthizer in the first term. He knows all those issues backwards and forwards. He's there in Stockholm. I think you're going to see USTR and the administration pushing these issues very hard. It's not easy to get China to make those type of commitments. But here, of course, as you know, they already made a lot of commitments. And I think the pressure on China to ultimately live up to those commitments and show that they're doing the things they promised President Trump was going to do is going to grow. Every single thing you guys are talking about in terms of what's happening with the economy and the other deals and the strength of the president politically, that's giving him more leverage in these negotiations. And I think the U.S. team knows how to use that leverage. So I expect more pressure on China with respect to each of the issues that you named.
John Carney, last 25 seconds. What does the Federal Reserve do? Jay Powell at the Taj Mahal. He shouldn't have built the underwater garage because the Potomac's coming over it, but that was last week's story. What happens? The Fed sees this. No retaliation, no global trade war, no inflation. I bet you get a decent GDP number on Wednesday. What's the Fed do, John?
The Fed is going to stay on hold, but watch August. When we get to the Jackson Hole conference that they have, you're going to see Jerome Powell do the pivot. He is going to say that the doves are flying from the Grand Tetons. They are going to be cutting in September.
Did you get an invitation to go out there?
I don't think they like me very much, Larry. I've said some pretty mean things about Jerome on this show.
Mine hasn't come yet in the mail. I must have overlooked it.
Lost.
I used to go there all the time, but that was a long time ago. Anyway, you're all fabulous. Not the Fed, but the rest of you. Katie Pavlich, Stephen Vaughn, John Carney. Terrific stuff.